The PlayStation brand has been around a while. It's seen 4 generations now, and over the course of about 20 years, has evolved pretty drastically. Today, gameranx is bringing you the evolution of PlayStation hardware. On September 9th, 1995, the North American market got the PlayStation. It was actually almost a year after Japan got it. Everybody who played console games at that point, which was a lot of people, had been looking at pictures of stuff that was playing on this thing for a year. It still had the benefit of having the jump on Nintendo's console, which came in 1996. And frankly, the competition with the Sega Saturn wasn't really that big. Part of that was though Sega Saturn's hardware was very flexible, it was incredibly difficult to develop for. PlayStation, on the other hand, had a focus. They wanted to make 3D games, and they wanted to make them before Nintendo.
Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived.
Pack up your stuff. I got a little surprise for you here. Check it out. What do you think about that? We got real-time, 3D, lush organic environments. How's that make you feel, buddy? Feel a little like your days are numbered?
It had a 1-core 33.87 megahertz CPU, 1 megabyte of video RAM, which was pretty high for the time, and 2 megabyte system RAM. Again, high for the time. Now that sounds bare bones, and if you put together something today with those kinds of specs, you wouldn't even try to do anything with it. It would probably be for a class or something. But at the time, for a game console, this was a pretty big deal. Now you have to remember, a game console didn't have to do much other than play games at the time. It didn't need a flashy GUI, it didn't need to run any apps whatsoever, voice recognition was not a thing, and like I said, you just needed to be able to play games. So if you really list off those specs and say, was it able to do what it needed to do at the time? Absolutely. Sony beat everyone to 3D. Sega had 3D on the 32X and on the Sega Saturn, but neither really caught on. PlayStation did 3D in a manner that people actually bought. It had 2 controller ports, you know, for wires, because wireless controllers at that point were all infrared and terrible. It output RCA composite video, which is basically standard video, was the same thing that your VCR put out, because you had a VCR at this point. And same with audio, RCA. It was not the first console to use CDs. The Sega CD add-on a couple years earlier has that distinction, although everyone hated it. The Saturn actually also had come out months prior to the PlayStation, and also used CDs. However, PlayStation did do something that was very distinct and made their CDs black. There wasn't really a reason the discs were black. It's essentially to differentiate, both from the Sega Saturn and from PC gaming. It was also a physical copy protection. If somebody handed you a PlayStation game on a regular CD, you were like, this isn't the real game. There was also no internal storage whatsoever, instead just a 128 kilobyte, yes that's kilobyte, memory card. Now these specs seem weak as all hell compared to what you're used to nowadays, but the fact of the matter is that nothing like this had really been out prior to this, and it brought 3D games to the mainstream before the Nintendo 64 did. On October 26th in the year 2000, PlayStation 2 was released, at least in North America. In Japan, it had launched only a few months earlier in March. However, that was a much smaller disparity between Japanese and English releases than the PlayStation 1. The PlayStation 2's CPU, dubbed the Emotion Engine, is 294.91 MHz at launch. Later models had 299 MHz. But 6 MHz really isn't that big of a difference. At launch, that CPU was almost 9 times faster than the PlayStation CPU, which is a huge jump. It still only had 1 core though. The GPU clocked in at 147.46 MHz, which shifted all the graphical processing off of the CPU and onto a dedicated chip. It had 4 megabytes of video RAM and 32 megabytes of system RAM. It was also the first game console to have USB ports. 2 of them to be exact. The USB ports weren't used for the controllers, but rather for peripherals like the iToy camera camera, which was a pretty cool thing for its time, and was definitely a precursor towards Microsoft's Kinect technology. The controllers were still wired, but now had thumbsticks. Analog sticks were kind of a big deal after the Nintendo 64, and it was important to be able to natively support that for further 3D games. It also came with 2 motors for rumble support, and people generally really liked the controller. Like the PlayStation 1, it saved to memory cards. However, PlayStation 2s were not 128 kilobytes, they were 8 megabytes, which is not an incremental difference, it's a massive difference. It also had a slot for a 40 gigabyte hard drive, which was actually required to play some games like Final Fantasy XI. It was a massive upgrade from the PlayStation 1, and kind of steamrolled everything else. The much improved graphics from the previous generation allowed for incredibly smooth, complicated 3D scenes for the time, and developers were able to use this to create some of the most revolutionary games of all time, with a lot of today's conventional gaming practices actually established on the PlayStation 2. The PlayStation 2 was the first console to use DVDs. The PlayStation 2 was actually sold as a DVD player, and began Sony's tradition of using its current gaming system to have every family have a player that can play the latest form of media. On November 17th, 2006, the PlayStation 3 came out. It was actually only 6 days after it came out in Japan, which bravo. Getting right to it, there's a huge difference between PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3. The CPU was a 3.2 GHz chip dubbed the Cell Broadband Engine. This is obviously a pretty powerful CPU compared to previous generations. It was more than 10 times as powerful as the PlayStation 2, and roughly 96 times as powerful as the first PlayStation. It was also the first PlayStation to have a multi-core processor, 7 of them to be exact. The GPU was a 550 MHz NVIDIA processor dubbed the RSX Reality Synthesizer. It's based on NVIDIA's G70 and features 256 megabytes of video memory, which is also the same amount of system RAM that the PlayStation 3 has.
Something in my head.
Whereas both the PlayStation 1 and the PlayStation 2 used specifically wired controllers, PlayStation 3 used wireless controllers. How? By Bluetooth. The controller itself wasn't very much different than the previous generation's controller. It was a little sturdier and a little nicer, but not terribly different. It still had 2 vibration motors, for instance, same button layout, same shape, but now had a rechargeable battery in it and could be plugged into the console via USB instead of a proprietary plug. Where the PlayStation 2 didn't really have a lot of output capabilities beyond the original PlayStation, PlayStation 3 was a massive change. Not only could you output to RCA composite, you could also output to component and HDMI, because the PlayStation 3 is the first PlayStation to allow HD video. Whereas all games were either 480i or 480p in the past, it was now possible to create games at 720p, 1080i, and 1080p. As you know, this is obviously a very big deal. The PlayStation 3 is also the first PlayStation with Wi-Fi connectivity. This allowed for a ton of new functions to be implemented, like downloadable content, multiplayer, various voice and video chat options, as well as an online store, which with the advent of Steam gave PlayStation owners kind of a similar interface to purchase their games. But it now also had an internal hard drive. The default that it came with was actually a 20 gigabyte hard drive, which is not that big. You could install your own hard drive or one of their hard drives and greatly increase that. Games got so much better, graphically speaking. Like the PlayStation 2 before it, the PlayStation 3 also introduced a new form of optical media. Sony's Blu-ray, a format they actually pioneered themselves, was included in the PlayStation 3. So with the PlayStation 4, North America actually got it first, on November 15th, 2013. PlayStation 4 also went just the exact opposite direction as the previous processor, where PlayStation 3 used a complex cell architecture that was proprietary. PlayStation 4 moved to an AMD x86-64 accelerated processing unit. Now, this is very different because just simply measuring the gigahertz for it isn't really an accurate accurate measurement in the change, because technically the processors would seem not nearly as good. There's two quad-core 1.6 GHz modules in the APU, where PlayStation 3 had a single processor with 7 cores. PlayStation 4 splits up all the work among 8 cores on 2 processors. The PlayStation 4 has 8 GB of RAM. This is 16 times the amount of RAM found on the PS3. It also includes some secondary chips, which are less powerful but handle tasks associated with downloading, uploading, and social components, so they can be handled in the background while somebody's playing a game or the unit is in sleep mode. Therefore, the PlayStation 4 can actually handle recording its own video output for uploading and sharing or using for various things. The GPU is actually built on AMD's Radeon GCN architecture, and actually consists of 18 CUs, or compute units, for a total of 1,152 cores, because there are 64 cores per CU. AMD is a founding member of the HSA Foundation, and Sony is a contributor, so the PlayStation 4 actually supports several of the features promoted by the Heterogeneous System Architecture standard, like HUMA, or Heterogeneous Uniform Memory Access, meaning the system memory is not partitioned, and though a portion of the 8 GB of RAM is available to the GPU, it's unified, and since the memory in the PlayStation 4 is GDDR5, it's capable of running extremely high clock frequencies and maxes out at 2.75 GHz. The controller is again a wireless rechargeable, but has been considerably redesigned. The PlayStation 4 controller is the best version of the PlayStation controller. It's comfortable, it's responsive, it's the perfect weight. It now also has a port that allows you to use a headset and mic with it, which is great for multiplayer gaming. The controller again connects with Bluetooth, but now actually has an LED on the front of the controller that, if you use the PlayStation camera, can be used as a motion control device, which in my opinion is considerably less silly than a stick with a ball at the end. We won't talk about that. PlayStation 4 is capable of all of the standard video formats 2160p, which is known as 4K to most people. Now, will it ever run a game in 4K? Probably not, but it can play videos and view pictures at an extremely high resolution. It continues the usage of Blu-ray that the PlayStation 3 had, but has placed a lot more emphasis on the online store, the PlayStation Network, in having a much larger hard drive and relying on the idea that most people have a better internet connection now as well. The PlayStation 4 is much closer to a PC than any previous PlayStation, which gives a lot more flexibility to programmers, knowing that the architecture itself is pretty similar to what people program on. Obviously, the hardware is significantly more powerful now than it was in 1995. We've seen some really cool improvements and a total change in how we even put together a video game console. Because of this, we're seeing games continue to evolve, both graphically and specifically in scope. Thanks to the strides in hardware, we're now able to see games that literally cover hundreds of square miles of territory. It's extremely exciting and a whole lot of fun just to think about what the next increment of the PlayStation is going to be. Is it even going to be a traditional video game console? It could be something completely different. So don't forget to leave a comment and click the like button. It helps us a ton. Also, if you're not subscribed, make sure you do that, because we release new videos every single day, and the best way to see them first is a subscription. We thank you so much for watching this video, and as always, we will see you next time here on gameranx.